What's going on, guys? It's Bromley, and I just did a video about things I wish I knew when I got started. It was a short list of some foundational principles that took me a long time to wrap my head around, and getting those down was absolutely integral to me not just lasting long enough to get good, but to finding out how to organize programming, how to train other people, and how to get the most out of my own training. So it was a very vital list of things I had to learn, and I learned them the hard way. Believe me, I wasted a lot of time, suffered a lot of injuries getting those down. Today, I'm going to talk about what I actually got right, what I had the good fortune of learning early on, what I started with, and how that ultimately impacted my training to the point where I don't think I would be where I am right now if I didn't start with those things. Real quick, remember Base Strength is on the Amazon store and at EmpireBarbellStore.com. It is $9.99, so go ahead and check that out. I have some publications coming down the pike, so stay tuned for those. Also, check out my Patreon. That is where I take questions from members to turn into videos. So if you want a question answered, if you want a question turned into a video, that is where I give priority attention to my patrons. So thank you everybody who's already signed up. We have a good community growing there, and I have a lot more to come, so stay tuned for that. So getting into this subject, what I knew, what I got right. The first thing, probably the most vital thing that I figured out, was the benefit of hard work. And that was actually the thing that attracted me to training to begin with. I wasn't physically active as a kid. I was moody, didn't have a lot of friends. I was overweight. And there was something innately attractive about going and breaking myself against these hard workouts. Part of it was the endorphin rush, right? You just feel amazing. That was something that I had never experienced in my life, and it was immediately addictive. I just knew instinctively, and I don't know if it was every 80s training montage that was glued into my brain, but I knew instinctively that I was doing something worthwhile and valuable, and that's where I should be putting my effort. I also had the sense that it was molding me as a person. It wasn't just about getting stronger, but every workout that I lived through said something about what I could tolerate, about how much pain I could go through, how much discipline and dedication I could express. And there was something just very gratifying about that, something that built a lot of confidence. And I started to feel that carry over into other aspects of life where I would be hesitant or anxious. There was something that carried over into the rest of my life where it's like, well, if I survive that brutal leg workout where I did 30 working sets and threw up after, I can suck it up and go live through that job interview. Or I could go talk to that girl, or I could go do whatever thing was giving me just immense anxiety that I otherwise would not have pushed myself to do. It led to this kind of cascade effect, this chain reaction, where I started to want to make myself uncomfortable because I knew that there was innate value to that. Now, as far as physical changes go, because life lessons are all well and good, but we're all here for the gains, let's be honest. The hard work is what, at the beginning, gave a big margin for error. It gave a lot of play in the joints because your training didn't have to be perfect. Your exercise selection didn't have to be perfect. Your recovery management didn't have to be perfect. If you were just working hard and you kept rolling that forward, you would grow. Now, in the things I got wrong video, I talked a lot about fatigue management and poor training organization, and that catches up with you down the road. But when you're a teenager and when you are new to lifting, you actually recover quite a bit easier than you do as you get more advanced. So you can get away with a lot more stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should. You still want to pay attention. But if there is a time to just blindly apply hard work and see how much value you can get out of that, that is the time where you want to do that. And those efforts that I put out, some of those just ball busting workouts that I've lived through, are still present in my head, and I still call back to them when I'm faced with doing something that maybe makes my palms a little bit sweaty. So I can't stress enough, you need to know how to work hard. And that doesn't mean just taking everything to a 10. It means doing things that you're not comfortable doing, sticking yourself to movements that you don't like, lasting through hard workouts. Even though you get halfway through, you want to take your ball and go home. You have to learn how to be uncomfortable because that is ultimately the only way that you are going to grow. Now that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, which is consistency, which is not new to anybody. You guys have heard the benefits or the necessity of consistency of being successful in any avenue in life. To lifting, it is no different. That is one of the things I got right out of the gate. And it was not so much that I knew that I had to adhere to this really strict timeline for training to grow. It was really that I loved training. When I got into it, there was something that was specifically appealing about it, and I had the urge to keep going back. It satisfied some biological need that I wasn't getting through like my lazy sedentary life up to that point. So that drove me to keep training day in, day out, multiple times a day if I had nothing else to do. And it was that consistency that allowed me to build so aggressively from one workout to the next, from one year to the next. So my teenage years was basically just a long string of PRs where I went from being an overweight 13-year-old that couldn't hang on the JV football field to being someone who's known as being as kind of the strong guy at the gym. And that was entirely because I didn't miss workouts. That was entirely because I was dedicated to getting through each workout, even if I was tired, if I was broken down. And that run of consistency gave me immense amount of insight as to how to pair workouts together. Eventually, what I took from how to actually manage fatigue, I had all of that data to go off of, all of that experience to go off of based on how I respond to certain exercise pairings or certain amounts of frequency or what the right amount of volume or effort is depending on a corresponding phase of training. So the consistency allowed me to get the information that actually turned me into a better lifter and better coach down the road. Bottom line is you're not going to progress if you're a binge purge type lifter. You can't go hard for a few months, get distracted, take some time off, and then think you're going to pick back up where you left off. You have to train consistently. You have to train through those lulls and plateaus. You have to commit to breaking through when things get difficult. You have to get creative. You have to pay attention. You have to take notes. That consistency is the only option. So you have to be consistent, and thankfully for me, that was never a problem. Even if I wasn't competitive, I would still train. And even into retirement, I'm sure I'm still going to train because I love training. So getting into the next one, variety. Now this is one that's a little strange because everybody in this day and age goes straight to specificity. They go straight to, I want to power lift, so I'm going to train like my favorite power lifter. And at some point, these kind of like super specific, high frequency, I'm inclined to call them Soviet inspired models, because that's a lot of what they derived from Olympic lifting, was doing the competitive movements over and over frequently throughout the week, manipulating volume intensity within the week to drive progress, as opposed to kind of westernized American culture is very influenced by bodybuilding. So that's where you get a bench day where you do all your bench bodybuilding work with it, or a squat day. So we see this a lot now. It's gotten very popular. And it's not that that's a bad thing. And if you do want to be competitive, there's definitely an era of training in your lifetime where you will benefit from doing long stretches of specific work. Remember, my whole base peak model is really going back and forth between phases of variety, broad development, fixing weaknesses, getting well-rounded, and then going into phases of training that are a lot more specific and a lot more oriented to specifically how you're going to compete. The problem I see with a lot of lifters is that even when they're undeveloped, they jump straight into uber-specific training, which I do not believe is the best bet. Now, that applies to somebody who wants to be as competitive as possible. Most people don't even fall into that category. You might want to compete at some point. You might want to get better over time. But most people, they like training for the sake of it. They're going to have goals that change over the years. There's going to be more of a journey that goes on. And I think that's okay. In fact, I think that's optimal in some sense because it will keep you engaged and inspired. And it will expose you to other things you wouldn't have exposed yourself to otherwise. I innately trained with a lot of variety because I had a lot of respect for other types of training. I was exposed to a lot of other types of training and I saw the value in them. And that all influenced me based on what I found that worked and what I carried forward, even as I got more competitively minded down the road. So I would do bodybuilding workouts. That was my first real education once I got out of football. I can't really call what the football coaches had us do in education. But I got out of football. All they had, early 2000s were bodybuilding magazines. The internet, YouTube, social media wasn't in the state that it is now. So my only inspiration really was what I found in bodybuilding magazines. So I did a lot of bodybuilding workouts. I'm like, they're big, they're strong. I want to be strong. That's what I'm going to do. It worked. I developed not only a tolerance to capacity, but I was able to test my pain tolerance because a lot of those workouts are very painful to get through. And there's a type of mental fortitude you need to last through these 2-hour bloodbaths where you do 30, 40, 50 working sets. And I grew like a weed. And funny enough, as I grew, I got stronger. It was the strangest thing. It was so weird that when my pecs and shoulders got bigger, my bench went up. That when my quads got bigger, my squat, it was very strange. I didn't think that's how it worked. But that variety and the respect I had for other non-powerlifting or non-strongman oriented types of training influenced me greatly, to the point where I dabbled in Olympic lifting. I taught myself how to do full versions of the clean and snatch. I started practicing jerks early on as a way to get good at overhead press before I was actually that strong of a presser. I even did CrossFit for a little bit. The gym that I worked at, I would test out the workouts for their strongman CrossFit hybrid workouts. Not necessarily my cup of tea, but I do not regret the time I spent there or the things I learned about myself going through those alternative modes of training. They were brutally difficult. I've done a lot of shitty training protocols over the years, a lot of really, really hard things. The CrossFit workouts were some of the worst. If you're kind of strong and you have a competitive mindset and you go at these workouts like your life depends on it, it is some of the most humbling, crippling pain and fatigue that you can ever experience. And anybody who disagrees with that was sandbagging their goddamn workouts. So anyways, the variety I did early on, it gave me insight to how other sports operate. It gave me insight on how to train different energy systems, gave me insight into how they carry over to each other, where one quality might benefit another, but more importantly, the point where it doesn't at all. And when you're trying to train for multiple training thresholds, you have to know where those lines in the sand are, because you can't bank on one thing making you better at something else if you end up just specializing in that and kind of branching off away from this other thing you want to get good at. So the variety was good. It made me well-rounded. It left me with very few weaknesses, and it gave me creativity and flexibility in my training, because there were times where I couldn't just train heavy and I had to rely on other methods to continue growing even when I couldn't go as heavy as possible. So that was very insightful, not just from an experiential point of view, but from an education, learning how all these pieces fit together. Now, fortunately for me, when I started, I stumbled across some older training publications. I was exposed early on to the idea that compound movements are where it's at. That was a big one, and this goes into movement selection. If you are going to have a training protocol that's made up of a lot of moving pieces, a lot of smaller exercises, a lot of variations, it's not that that's not doable, but you are walking a less sturdy tightrope. And if you deviate a little bit, you can really shoot yourself in the foot with your progress. Some of the most brutally effective runs I've ever gone on had just emphasized developing skill in a movement. I would hyperfixate on a movement. I would do it twice per week. I would progress it linearly over time until it became unsustainable, and then I would change something and keep going. Maybe I change the exercise, maybe I change the split, maybe I change the threshold I'm working in. There's a lot of options. Bottom line is, I would emphasize compound movements as my main developers. And actually, when I first started getting really competitive in strongman, there were only about 4 or 5 barbell exercises I did throughout the week, and that was it. I got really strong over a couple of years doing that. Now, long term, yeah, you'll probably develop weaknesses, you'll probably get imbalances, you might get stagnant, and you're going to be better off going back to some form of variety. But the compounds were where it's at, and that's something I figured out early on. They are so brutally effective as a developmental exercise that, again, it gives you a lot of play in the joints with how you program it. You don't have to be so razor thin with your programming. In addition to that, in strength sports, it's also the thing that we compete in. So if you do a lot of pressing, squatting, and deadlifting, and you see that in a competition, not only did doing those movements develop you physically, but it gave you the skill you need to execute them in contests. So it's a 1-2 punch. For other sports, you do a lot of strength training and cardio work and a lot of different modes of training to get yourself in physical shape, and that's markedly different than whatever you actually do the day of the contest. In strength sports, it's very much one and the same, so that kind of works out best for us. So compound movements, that's not news to anybody, but it does bear repeating, and that's something I definitely got right early on. Now, this next one actually kind of ties into the point about variety. When I started training, it wasn't just about power lifts, even though my emphasis was very much on strength. I enjoyed bodybuilding workouts and isolation exercises. I enjoyed the Olympic lifts. I even enjoyed messing around with certain body weight movements. I also enjoyed general activity. When I was a teenager, I would actually run. I liked testing my mile time in PE every week when we would do it. I liked sticking myself to the back of the soccer players and seeing how long I could keep up. So my dedication in doing things that weren't solely strength oriented went a long way. Again, it taught me how to deal with that pain tolerance. It taught me how different these thresholds are and how they tie into each other. So you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about training by doing this, but it also instilled in me a little bit of a motor where even when I'm out of shape, I know what it's like to get to that point and I can come back. And that's something I use to peak for me. It's like the one I'm peaking for right now, where I do have to have an endurance component. It's not something I shy away from. It's not something I'm scared of. I've been down that road. Cardio, general physical activity, anything that's low intensity and not specifically strength oriented, it's good for you. It's good for your mental state. It's good to help keep excess body fat off. And it's good to teach you that there's more to life than just going in and being a human forklift. It's cool to be strong, but I think it's a lot better to be useful. And if you're not in good cardiovascular shape, you're not of use to anybody in really any scenario. If you're the type of guy that sweats during your bench warm-ups with 135, you're not going to be much use helping me move. You're not going to be much use in a fight. You're not even really going to be much use in normal tests of strength where you have to last through a day of training. You need some type of cardiovascular base to meet the minimum threshold of not being a piece of shit. The last thing that I got right, and this is a big thing. This is a big thing. And I don't even know in hindsight where to really credit this to. I don't know if I can credit this to my family, to whatever like pop culture TV shows or characters that I was attracted to as a kid that I saw as role models. I don't know if it was from sports. It might have been from all of the above. But I held very high standards for myself early on. So one of the things I got right that was integral in me chasing numbers and consistently working to improve myself, I did not sell myself a story. This goes under the umbrella of kind of like general life wisdom as it relates to success. But I did not sell myself a story about how good I was or about how unique or special I was, or even if my efforts were good enough. Something that kind of gets instilled in my brain, and this is where a lot of my critique of modern competitive culture comes from, is that if you are a competitor, if you identify in that way, if competing is something that's important to you and you want to excel and get better and set yourself apart, you will never truly be satisfied with the outcome. You might recognize improvement and progress. You might surprise yourself at some point with things you've done you didn't think you were capable of. But at the end of the day, the second you hit that goal that you've been chasing, you will always be looking upwards and thinking, what's next? Every meet you do, whether you win or lose, you will be thinking, how much better was the other person at their training than I was? How much more dialed in were they? What about the other people that didn't show up? How much better were they? Who didn't show up that could have taken this trophy from me? It's not just about being critical when you lose and taking ownership that things didn't go the right way because you weren't perfect in your prep. It's also about taking ownership of when you do win, all of the things that could have potentially taken that win from you, because that is the only way you can prepare yourself. That is the only way you can pad yourself with enough experience, enough practice, and enough physical ability that you can predictably go from being somebody who enjoys competing to someone who enjoys winning, because it happens a lot. As a competitor, it is your job to be honest with yourself, to rate your efforts, rate your prep, rate your discipline. And if you're being honest with yourself, you're going to realize that nothing exceeds a 9 out of 10 because 10s don't exist. So knowing that that's the case, you should always be trying to improve your game. If you're serious about winning and identifying as a winner, you need to be honest with what you didn't do that you should have, what you did okay that you could have done better. To have had enough influence early on where I learned that the quickest way to spin yourself in circles is to prioritize the instant gratification that comes from telling yourself a story about how good you are. That's superficial, it's hollow, it doesn't make you better. If you actually want to get better, you have to be honest. So that's probably one of the biggest ones. In fact, that should probably be at the front of the list. Everything worthwhile in my life that I have built, I built on the foundation of that principle. So if there's anything that you take away from this video, it should be that. So those are just some of the things I did right, fortunately for me, that gave me some play in the joints. It padded me against all of the other mistakes that I inevitably would make over the years. And it's only on that foundation that I stand where I am now. It's been 20 years chipping away, trying to be something that looks like a competitive athlete, and every day I'm a little bit closer. I still got some miles to go, but I hope this was insightful. If you have any questions or experiences that you want to comment on, leave it in the comment box. I'll get back to them as soon as possible. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.